Amendment 43 is at Clause 4, page 3, line 5, where I seek to insert the words, "Financial assistance under this section must not be provided if there exists credible evidence of modern slavery in the energy supply chain of any company designated Great British Energy." In moving Amendment 43, I thank the Noble Baroness Lady Kennedy of the Shores, Lord Blencathra, and the Bishop of St Albans for their support, and Earl Russell for indicating his support and that of his colleagues, and I in turn are very happy to support his amendments 100 and 109, which are grouped with Amendment 43. Let me begin by thanking the Noble Lord, the Minister, Lord Hunt of Kingsheath, for making good on his promise of a meeting to discuss this amendment and for the involvement at that meeting of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance for China. Lady Kennedy is co-chair of IPAC with Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, Member of Parliament, and he, she and I are all sanctioned by the People's Republic of China with 4 other parliamentarians. Lady Kennedy regrets being unable to be here this evening. During the meeting with the Noble Lord, Lord Hunt, we discussed a number of questions which I had raised at second reading, and I'd be extremely grateful if, when he comes to reply this evening, if he's in a position to do so, if he could answer the question that I put to him about the Forced Prison Made Goods Act of 1897, but in addition, could he also say what assessment he and his officials have made of the implications for the Proceeds of Crime Act, which in the context of the Uyghurs has been to the Court of Appeal on other issues, and for that matter, compatibility with the European Convention of Human Rights. And I mentioned that as a member of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, which is about to be reconstituted tomorrow, and I hope it will look at this question of human rights compatibility. I should also mention the reports which have appeared on BBC World in the last couple of days. One of those reports concerns tomato puree being sold in the UK under the false label of being Italian when it was actually made by slave labour in Xinjiang. Reports included details of Uyghurs who were beaten and subjected to electric shocks for not meeting their targets. And last night, the Panorama programme reported that other Uyghur Muslims told BBC I, the World Service Investigators Unit, made possible, I might add, by a grant from the FCDO, that if they failed to pick 450 kilograms a day, they would be strung up by chains from the ceiling and beaten until they fainted. The BBC showed huge factories linked to the detention camps with millions of square feet of space. And it's easy to imagine solar panels being made in such places, which of course are not open to inspection. They're part of a vast co-located complex which aims to undercut all competition and replace capacity crucial to domestic and military needs in the United Kingdom, to replace it with a world dependent on an authoritarian state with hegemonic ambitions. My Lords, this amendment returns to the question that I raised during second reading and poses a simple question to the House. Do we want a slavery-free green transition, or are we content to allow the laudable aims of the government to be achieved through forced labour? Some of your lordships may disagree with the framing of the question, perhaps fearful of overstatement. Unfortunately, though, as I've just described, the reality is that stark. My argument revolves around the following 3 predicates. First, China dominates much of the renewable supply chain, an issue that's been raised earlier in our debates by the Noble Lord, Lord Hamilton and others. Secondly, forced labour is widely and credibly demonstrated to be present throughout the Chinese renewable supply chain. And the third predicate is that net zero targets are unachievable without Chinese-made renewables. Therefore, the argument runs 2030 cannot be achieved without slavery. My Lords, let me unpack this. Firstly, China's dominance. According to the International Energy Agency, I quote, solar is on course to account for 2/3 of this year's increase in global renewable power capacity, and further strong growth is expected in 2024. And indeed, the Noble Lord, the Minister, Lord Hunt, referred to that in earlier exchanges. The International Energy Agency also says this: China has invested over $50 billion in new PV supply capacity 10 times more than Europe and created more than 300,000 manufacturing jobs across the solar PV value chain since 2011. They say today China's share in all the manufacturing stages of solar panels, such as polysilicon, ingots, wafers, cells and modules, exceeds 80%. This is more than double China's share of global PV demand, and in addition, the country is home to the world's 10 top suppliers of solar PV manufacturing equipment. My lords, this is a concerning picture, yet this shouldn't come as any surprise. It's no secret that China has for a long time wished to develop strategic monopolies over the renewable sector, together with other areas of critical infrastructure. And as I've argued here before, perhaps some would say rather tediously, and I apologise if that has been the case, but my lords, as I've said before, we've allowed ourselves to become more and more dependent on the CCP regime as our own national resilience has simultaneously been emasculated. As recently as 2020, Chairman Xi Jinping gave a speech to the 7th session of the Communist Party's Finance and Economy Committee, when he said China will, and now I quote him directly, aim to form a counter-attack and deterrence against other countries by fostering killer technologies and strengthening the global supply chain's dependence on China, close quotes. The problem is broader, though, than photovoltaics. Rare earths production, which noble lords will know is essential to the renewable supply chain, is again utterly dominated by China. As far back as the 1990s, Deng Xiaoping himself is reported to have said, where the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. And I quote from a report by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. China dominates the supply chain, accounting for 70% of global rare earth ore extraction and 90% of rare earth ore processing. Notably, China is the only large-scale producer of heavy rare earth ores. The Institute goes on to explain this dominance has been achieved through decades of state investment, export controls, cheap labour and low environmental standards. It isn't just think tanks, my lords, who are exercised about the degree of UK renewable market exposure. As Jane Basden, co-founder of Zenobe Energy, said last year, they, China, control the supply chain all the way from the minerals through to assembly and distribution. That means both our power sector and automotive sector are very dependent on Chinese products. Suffice it to say, my lords, nobody disputes that China has a stranglehold on the renewable supply chain. So on to my second predicate, forced labour unavoidable in the renewable supply chain. Well, forced labour is widely and credibly demonstrated to be present throughout the Chinese renewable supply chain. The problem is especially pronounced within the solar supply chain. According to Jenny Chase, head of solar analysis at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I quote, nearly every silicon-based solar module, at least 95% of the market, is likely to have some Xinjiang silicon in it. My lords, why then would it be a problem for 95% of the market to have Xinjiang silicon? Well, first and most crucial to understand is that polysilicon material is crucial and is the single primary material needed to produce most solar panels. My lords, solar panels that do not use polysilicon enjoy a negligible share of the global solar power market. Most crucially of all, according to a 2023 report by Crawford and Murphy, all, not most, but all manufacturers of this material in Xinjiang are tied to Uyghur forced labour. The reason for this is that the entire process used to create metallurgical grade silicon from mining to production is highly dependent on state-sponsored labour transfer programs. In 2021, Murphy and Elmer published their landmark report in broad daylight, which I cited at second reading, and in which they set out the connection between labour transfer schemes in China and the solar industry. The report names a number of companies using labour transfer schemes. In the years following that, the problem has only got worse. The 2023 report, Overexposed, says this: none of the companies that were engaged in state-sponsored labour transfers in 2021 has announced any changes to its recruitment methods or shown any resistance to participation in the PRC's government's programmes. Indeed, since that time, the PRC government's labour transfer programme has only increased in scale, and the pressure on companies to absorb the workers the state deemed to be surplus remains high. The report names Canadian Solar, JA Solar, Jinko Solar, Longji Solar, Mexion Solar Technologies, SunPower, Meyer Burger Technology, AG, Q-Cells, REC, Tongwei Solar, Trina Solar. All companies were found to participate in state-imposed forced labour schemes. I note here that Canadian Solar was a major beneficiary in the recent solar development announcements made by the new Secretary of State. I note too that all the information used to compile these important reports comes from publicly available documents, many of which are Chinese government documents. And what exactly are these labour transfer schemes that we would be signing up to and continuing to invest British taxpayers' money in these projects? The PRC has placed millions of citizens from Uyghur region into what they call surplus labour and labour transfer programmes. Local governments and labour agencies are required to meet quotas for these programmes, and as of September 2020, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, its government claims to have placed 2.6 million Uyghurs and others in these state-sponsored programmes. In 2021, the government reported as many as 3.2 million people transferred, and it appears that the programme is growing significantly. Those who are conscripted into the programmes are compelled to transfer to work in farms and factories across the Uyghur region, as well as into the interior of China. For those who don't come directly from the internment camps, the government required that at least one person from every household in southern Xinjiang accept a state-mandated labour transfer to a factory or farm. And in December 2021, government directives required that all people who were able to work must be in some form of work. The PRC claims that these labour transfer programmes are part of a national campaign for poverty alleviation. However, the programmes involving Uyghurs and other minority citizens operate differently from other poverty alleviation programs throughout China because for individuals from the Uyghur region, the constant threat of internment makes refusing the state-sponsored work placement impossible. Labour transfers are deployed in the Uyghur region within an environment of unprecedented fear and coercion. Refusal to participate in any government programme, such as labour transfers, for reasons perceived to be religious in any way, is viewed as equivalent to aligning oneself with the three evils: separatism, terrorism, and religious extremism. And thus, anyone who refuses to work or attempts to walk away from their job risks internment or imprisonment. Therefore, my lords, the programmes are tantamount to the forcible transfer of populations, forced labour, human trafficking, and the enslavement by international definitions and protocols. And I placed on record here my gratitude to the Helena Kennedy Centre at Sheffield Hallam for their excellent brief on this point. So I turn to the third leg of the argument, namely that renewable targets are currently unachievable without slavery. Now, on the face of it, the arguments seem to stack up worryingly. China controls the supply chain and state-imposed forced labour is present throughout it. How then will we meet our 2030 targets without slavery? The conundrum is that we appear to need Chinese solar to meet our climate targets, but Chinese solar is badly tainted, as I've described, with modern slavery. And this isn't just about modern slavery and Uyghur genocide. The CCP regime is the world's biggest polluter, and it uses the Uyghur region as its national hub for oil, gas and coal, fueling their factories with cheap coal. So the solar panels of Xinjiang are not only made by slave labour, they have a higher carbon footprint than those manufactured elsewhere in the world. So, my lords, what do we do? Despite this deliberately created monopoly, built on the broken backs of slaves, we don't have to become complicit. Other countries are facing the same dilemma and are acting to address it. German solar companies are calling on the German government to support the domestic solar industry and help to resurrect it. The US government have included a ban on imports from a silicone producer in Xinjiang. Canada has banned the import of solar panels from specific Chinese companies, while Australia has called for more local renewable energy production and manufacturing and a certificate of origin scheme to counter concerns about slave labour. What is clear is that if democratic nations like ours are to achieve decarbonisation, This will need a mix of approaches, developing alternatives not dependent on polysilicon, rebuilding domestic solar supply chains, focusing procurement on companies that have shifted supply chains out of Xinjiang and developing better tools for reliable sourcing. And all this hinges on our government insisting that it will not be purchasing solar panels from companies that use slave labour and prioritising instead ethical sourcing and labour practices and recognising that such firm action is the way to create demand for responsible production. My Lords, I hope I haven't exhausted the House, but my Lords, these are crucially important questions and they do involve much of the £8 billion that we are setting aside on these programmes. Rebuilding our national resilience and reducing our dependency on authoritarian states who threaten our freedoms should be in the DNA of every policy which the government promulgates. I beg to move.